This is the Blue Collar Future Podcast, and we talk about the future of trade work. So, today, in keeping with the trade specific talks, the trade series that we've been doing, going to be moving on to framing, which I know a lot of people that frame. I've seen a little bit of the process, I've helped a little bit on my own house. Um, so, I feel somewhat qualified to at least speak on the real aspects of framing in a way that can kind of help people make a decision on what they want to do. However, I will be still bringing on later on an expert in this field to talk about framing in a way that we can show the real benefits, the real pros and cons to framing. Few things that have been going on lately. We're still going on our house, still going strong on that. Probably won't be doing any guests for a while. This is a way for me to talk and have a consistent topic and also not have to schedule guests. I mentioned last episode, but there's a lot going on with our house project and it's hard to schedule guests right now. I will probably be doing that again soon. I really do miss having guest interviews and having guest podcasts. That used to be my favorite part about doing the podcast. Um, but right now I'm just focusing on keeping going, um, keeping kind of some thoughts and ideas flowing. And I think the best way to do that is just to keep making episodes and keep moving forward. And I appreciate anybody who's following along with it. So let's get into this episode, framing. A lot of people think about framing and they really like the idea, but it's another thing that I think people get started into and then they quit too soon. Um, First of all, there's a few different framing disciplines, I'd say. You can do stick framing or post frame. Post frame is kind of the barn dominium, pole barn stuff that you see a lot lately. Stick framing is how most houses here in the US are framed. It's kind of one of the more popular ways to frame, modern ways to frame nowadays. You can kind of go the commercial residential aspect, like we've talked about with all the other ones, where you can be working on commercial projects or homes. You can do steel buildings, which typically would be commercial and only commercial. And most of the time, commercial buildings will be steel buildings, which is kind of in a way post frame, but with steel instead of lumber. As far as as my understanding of kind of the mechanics of the way it works, it's relatively similar. The most labor intensive is stick framing, which is a lot of smaller commercial and residential projects are all stick frame. A lot of buildings nowadays, the exterior walls are created using concrete, doing tilt panels. So the concrete is poured flat on the ground and it's finished like normal. And then they stand it up. And that ends up actually being the outside of the wall. Or, a lot of buildings, the exterior walls will be brick blocks, I guess. Um, but so that being said, is like the exterior, the shell is a lot of times in commercial construction a little bit different, but then there's still a lot of framing to be done on the inside on individual rooms and that type of stuff. I wanted to touch on something real quick. Money. The money aspect isn't something I said I was going to talk about, but I decided kind of not to. Reason being is I haven't talked about pay because most everything pays the same relative to the equivalent skill level of a different trade or discipline, um, all based on the amount of skill and knowledge you need to have, the amount of time that you have, um, the amount of risk you're taking, how much time is required from you. Um, I know a lot of people might not enjoy to hear that, but most everything is reflected equivalently in the pay based on what you're required to do and what is expected of you. For example, most of the time, a commercial application, there's more risk and there's more at stake when there are screw ups. There's also more money involved in the projects. The projects are bigger. A lot of times, there's a lot more budget to pay people more, but a lot of times it's more work and it is more time. Um, I keep talking about the concrete aspect. The concrete aspect for commercial construction is really early hours and a lot of times long hours still. And a lot of people don't like that, but it does pay more than, say, residential concrete flat work. So that's why I kind of haven't talked about pay that much because it's really relative to where you are, your amount of skill, how much you're willing to dedicate to learning, because there are some things like being an electrician, plumber, HVAC, where you're sort of required to have certifications to make a certain amount of money, and to lead crews and stuff. A lot of times, other trades don't require any certifications, just time on the job, and you can start work your way up, no education, and become a foreman and make pretty good money and work your way up through specific companies and make good money that way just by working in sweat equity. Um, I recently heard a story about the Lifetime CEO. He actually just passed away. That's why I heard about it. But he actually became the CEO of Lifetime by starting off as a welder and working his way all the way up to the top level of the company and being the CEO. Making really good money, had a really good life for his family. Started off as a welder. Welding is one we'll get to later, but that's just an example. Um, it is possible. It does happen. Didn't have any handouts. A lot of people don't have handouts. In fact, one of my last guests, Brett Turley, didn't have handouts either. He started off welding, learned everything there was to know, had found somebody that was willing to teach him and willing to kind of take him up under his wing to set him up to run his company. Um, there's opportunities everywhere like that. You just have to look and you have to be willing and able to stick around and to learn. As a framer, you have a kind of a wide variety of tasks that you um, perform, and you have a lot to do in the project. You create the shell of the structure most of the time that everybody works on and in. A lot of times that shell, you build the outside shell and then you do, additional framing on the inside, whatever is necessary. But it still stands that you are building the shell, you're creating the shell that everybody else works on and works in. Kind of similar as foundation, the foundation work, concrete work, and flat work. You're creating you're creating the base of the project. When a lot of people say building homes or you build buildings or structures, most of the time people are going to jump to, oh, you're a framer because you're creating these structures. A crappy frame job will make all of the other subcontractors that follow the HVAC, plumber, electrical, they'll all um, be annoyed. The exterior guys, the interior guys, with the drywall, the finish work and trim work, everybody following the framers will be annoyed if they do a crappy frame job or if they have crappy lumber. It affects everybody else, but it's actually not something that is typically seen by the time the end of the project comes. So it's an interesting scenario there where as a framer, you're affecting everybody on the whole project, but nobody necessarily sees the work that you do because it gets covered up. At the end of the day, it gets covered up. Kind of like foundations as well. The foundations affect everybody. A lot of times, framers actually get really affected by the foundation and the flat work that comes before them because it will really affect how well of a job they can do framing the house based on how well the foundation um, is built. Like if it's square, the walls are straight, the grades are right, and they're not up and down all over the place because that happens a lot. That affects framers very heavily, and a lot of times there's only so much they can do with that, and it ends up getting covered up as well. But it is still the base, it's still the structure, and still need to do a quality job, even though it gets covered up, because that is the foundation, the frame job. Those are the structure, the actual structural support of the house. Everything else that follows is usually just slapping finishes onto them so that you're not looking at lumber, so that they are slapping on protection, visuals, all that type of stuff in there. So that being said, knowing how to frame and being good at it are different. You need to be able to come across and be able to read the plans and see what it's like on site and be able to make adjustments and corrections as you go that fit into the codes and the what the plans call for, but also is a good solution because a lot of times what ends up happening is you start off with the house plan, and we're going off of houses because it's kind of an easy place to start. You have these house plans drawn, and everybody goes off of those. The architect will typically find elevations, and they'll draw up the plan for the elevations of the specific place that they're being built. The footing and foundation guy, they will set their stuff to grade after the excavator has dug down a sufficient amount as per what the plan calls out, and they will do their stuff to their best ability. But a lot of times the foundation can be off a few inches here, a foot there, and going off of the actual measurements of the plan, it's not quite the same. My house in particular ended up being a couple inches off here, a couple inches off there. One wall was moved a little bit farther than it was supposed to be. All little differences that make a big change, and that happens on just about every house out there. Um, there are it is actually hard, especially nowadays, to find projects where that doesn't happen. And a lot of times it's just unreasonable plans or the situation or mistakes being made. But it's actually not that big of a deal because the to the inch doesn't necessarily matter. This is the rough plan to follow to get the desired project. So you need to be able to read the plans, read on site, take the measurements, and frame accordingly, and then come across situations where maybe wasn't completely thought out on the plans and actually isn't explicitly drawn on the plans, but you need to come up with a solution that will solve those problems. Um, I can keep talking about my house in particular because I was there a lot for the framing project, but for example, going up into our upstairs, our bonus room, wasn't all explicitly drawn out on the plans. And when you're looking at a two-dimensional drawing, it's hard to see how it works out three-dimensionally in the framing. And we had to make some changes, and some things didn't line up specifically how they were supposed to. And the framers had to kind of give a little here, take a little there, to make it all work. And it ended up being great. It worked out great, but it's not exactly how the plan shows it to be. And usually that's how it goes. They don't go specifically to plan. And most of the time, by the time the framer is done, people don't necessarily look at the plan anymore. They take actual field measurements of things because most of the time it ends up being a little bit different here, a little bit different there, and can make a big difference in estimations that they give. Um, and need to be able back onto that. You'll need to be able to look at this problem, try to think of a solution, and work through that with the client or the general contractor, whoever's running the project, to find the best case scenario. Because it is hard to draw out those plans and to have them work out perfectly in real life. Another example is how the plans are drawn and how it's framed. Doesn't necessarily mean it will work for how the HVAC system needs to run through the house. So if you have air ducts that need to run up into the ceilings and across the house, and you don't have a good pathway to go, and they've got to come out below where the ceiling is going to go, that happens on almost every house there is, and those are called ceiling drops. And then the framers have to come back through and cover that up with framing, the the air ducts that come through. But that doesn't necessarily isn't explicitly drawn in the house plan. So a lot of times that doesn't work out the way it should be. And it's just all adjustments that need to be made along the project. Some of the tasks as a framer will be, operating a lot of power tools, as you probably well know, saws, drills, nail guns, air compressors are huge for framers. I'd say for framers and finished carpenters, and then roofers to some extent, but maybe not nowadays. All use air compressors and pneumatic nail guns that shoot nails with air pressure. Nowadays, I think cordless nail guns will be becoming pretty popular, but the technology isn't quite there. Regardless, a lot of different types of power tools you need to be operating, working with lumber, steel, all of that can be really fun and rewarding. But like I said, it's not necessarily something that you see at the end of the project. You see the what's covering, you see the outline of the job that the framer does, but it gets covered up by everything else. But a good frame job will make a house look way better because each sub will be able to do a little bit better job because they're not having to bend so much to a crappy frame job. Framers are usually on one project longer than just about any other subcontractor, unless it's a super simple frame job, which doesn't always happen. But if it's a super simple frame job, chances are it's super simple for the other subs as well. They're typically on a job twice as long as the next contractor. Most contractors are no more than a week on a project, depending on the situation. Framers are easily 3-4 weeks on a specific house and project. And from the moment they start to the moment they finish, a lot of it is different. Building the walls and standing them up, setting the trusses, building the inside walls, doing the sheeting around the outside, sheeting the roof, doing the backing, like putting boards in between all the studs for places to nail to for the other subcontractors. And that's where being a good framer comes into play, because if you only did the bare minimum, it makes it hard for a lot of people to come after you and to be able to nail into studs and not just drywall, because the drywall is a big part after that. Um, lot of there's a lot of ins and outs in framing, and I think they're on the project the longest, but every day is slightly different, and you're doing enough different stuff across the project that it makes it seem like it could be different jobs. I think after like as I've been watching different projects go along, it's cool to see how many different days are involved, but there's also a lot involved, and you could come to a project and be waiting on trusses and have to figure out how to either come back or waste time on that project getting ready to set trusses. You could be short on certain material and need to work around that. There's a lot required to go into framing. And sometimes, if you don't have the answers, say you run into a problem and need to know what the best solution is and you don't hear it back, you need to be able to work around that and keep going. And since you're on a project for so long, if you are delayed on one project, it delays you to another project, and people are likely to find someone else if you can't get to their project. So being a framer is a pretty, I think it's a cool job, and it's a hard job to do because there is a big demand, but there's a lot of framers out there, and it is a long process, and people are likely to just go find someone else if you can't get to it. And a lot of times, you not being able to get to it is dependent on other projects that you are doing. A lot of delays can cause a lot of issues for framers. And I don't envy people being business owners and framers, but I think it would be a really cool profession to be in. And that is one profession that I have actually thought that I could do. I could I could be a framer. I'm not sure I could be a business owner framer, but I think I could be a framer because just about everybody wants to, pick up a saw every day and pick up a saw and a nail gun and put lumber together and make walls and build structures. I think that's a inherent desire of almost every man out there. Same with operating equipment, getting in a big excavator and or a big front end loader and moving dirt around. I think that's one thing that most men would say that they would like to do. And for that reason, I do think that I would like framing, and it's always been a profession that I think I'd be interested in. So if you're interested in framing, or if you think somebody might be, send them this episode, send them this podcast if you think they'll get something out of it. If you are a framer and you think I did injustice to framing, let me know. I'll have framers on to talk about this in the future to get a real framer's perspective on the trade of framing. But I think it is a good profession, and there's a lot of room for growth nowadays because there's a lot of people retiring, just like with every trade. So I think, as we go along this trade series, if you think you might want to start in a trade, start in it. Don't worry about as much the pay and uh, the hours and the demand and how much skill you need and all that stuff. Just get started, see if you like it, and all of that stuff will fall in line. There's always opportunities in every industry with different companies, all of that to succeed in no matter what trade you end up picking. As always, thank you for your support, and we'll see you next week.